what do we learn about Jesus' arrest? I'm going to pull from John chapter 18. But before I begin, did you know that if one goes to the account in John, that is of Jesus' arrest, that Judas does not kiss Jesus? When the soldiers and high priest came looking for Jesus, Jesus identifies himself as the one that they're looking for. And we do not read in John of the arrest account of Jesus where Peter is identified as the one who cuts off the ear of the high priest's servant. It's not there. The accounts of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all read differently. If one reads the account in Matthew, we do read where Judas kisses Jesus so that the soldiers and high priests know that this is the one that they're looking for. Yet Peter is not mentioned as the one who cuts off the servant of the high priest's ear. In the Mark account, we also see where Judas kisses Jesus, and Peter is not identified. That is not mentioned by name as being the one who cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And in the Luke account, it's the same thing. Judas kisses Jesus, but Peter is not identified as being the one who draws his sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. We only see in the John account of Jesus' arrest where Peter is identified as the one who drew his sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And in the John account, we don't see where Judas kisses Jesus. Jesus himself, like, volunteers and says, I'm the one you're looking for. There was no kiss made to identify Jesus as being the one that they're looking for by Judas. So what lesson can we learn from the arrest account of Jesus? I'm going to pull from the John account found at John chapter 18 and beginning at verse 1 and reading on down through verse 11. I'll put it on the screen here so you can follow along. Beginning at verse 1. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. So Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them. Notice here, Jesus goes out and asks them. Judas doesn't kiss Jesus, but Jesus goes out and asks them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. Then Jesus says, I am he. So we see here, Jesus identifies himself to the chief priests and the Pharisees and the soldiers. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. And here at verse 10, we see Peter taking out his sword to cut off the ear of that servant of the high priest. Then Simon Peter, who had the sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Jesus was betrayed and handed over. Now, what is the lesson in this account for those of us who are his followers? Jesus mentions at Matthew chapter 24, beginning at verse 9, down through verse 13, Jesus says, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. You see, Jesus was handed over. Now Jesus is saying to us, his followers, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death. And you will be hated by all nations because of me. And at that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate one another. Jesus was also betrayed. He was handed over and he was betrayed. Yet in the future, his faithful and true followers will be betrayed and handed over by those that they think are their brethren in the Lord, hand over to the authorities. In Revelation, this would be the beastly authority, because in the future days, there'll only be one kingdom on the earth. After Christ's kingdom will have ended, the kingdom of the beast, and our own brethren will betray us, just as Judas betrayed not only Jesus, but he betrayed the other 11 apostles. And we will be persecuted and put to death. There will be no escape in some rapture. If you are a true follower of Christ, you should expect to be betrayed, handed over, persecuted, and put to death, as Jesus says here. You should expect to be hated by all nations because of him. At verse 10, Jesus says, at that time, many will turn away from the faith. So all this talk about being saved and once saved, always saved, that's not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus says that many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate one another. So how can one fall away from the faith if they never had faith in the first place? So these are individuals who had faith, but they fell away from it. And then they'll betray and hate one another. So be careful when you hear individuals talk about that you are saved. And once you're saved, you can never lose it. In other words, once saved, always saved. That is not what Christ taught. Many Christians believe that once saved, always saved narrative, and they believe that they are saved. Jesus never said that. Jesus goes on to say here at verse 11, many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. This once saved, always saved, and you are saved teachings are false teachings from false teachers and false prophets. Jesus is talking to you. Are you listening? At verse 12, Jesus goes on to say, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. That's deep. The love of most? At present, the earth's population just went over 8 billion people. I would think that in distant future days, the population of the earth will be far more than that, because we have to account for the many billions who have died and will be resurrected. But Jesus says here that the love of most will grow cold. That shows how his faithful followers will be encamped by the world, who will hate them because of him. Now, what Jesus says next, many Christians ignore. They prefer to hear the rapture teaching because that sounds good. But Jesus says, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. You see, that's a conditional statement there. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Will be. So followers of Christ must stand firm through something. And I've mentioned this before in previous videos. We must stand firm through a great testing period in the future. And that great testing period is called the Great Tribulation. It is during that time that Christ's faithful followers will be betrayed, handed over, persecuted, and put to death, and hated by all the nations in those future days. But Jesus says here, verse 13, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. So, if one makes it through the Great Tribulation and you come out on the other side of that faithful, then you'll be saved to what? Eternal life. Granted entry into God's kingdom, which comes down to the earth. So during that future time period of the Great Tribulation, are you going to draw your swords, and will you say as Jesus said, Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? The cup that Christ's followers must drink if they are going to be granted eternal life is that they must go through the great tribulation, the threat of death, being put to death, being betrayed, handed over, persecuted. Are you ready for that? You see, Christianity is lying to you. It's telling you things that are easy to hear and easy to accept. The lie. Christianity is teaching and telling many individuals that don't worry, Jesus is going to come down and take all of you guys off of the earth and you all go up to heaven. And then the great tribulation will occur. Yet, if one goes to Revelation chapter 7, beginning at verse 9 and read down through verse 13, we see a great multitude whose numbers could not even be counted. And they're wearing white robes. And the elder asked the Apostle John, those who are wearing the white robes, who are they and where do they come from? John didn't know. So the elder tells him, these are those who come out of the great tribulation. Christ's faithful followers are subject to the future great tribulation. Many will come out on the other side faithful, and they'll be wearing white robes. They will have washed their robes white in the blood of the Lamb. That's allegorically. And they're holding palm branches in their hands. They will be victorious. And if you go to Revelation chapter 2, verse 10, we see the mention of death mentioned there and persecution mentioned there. But if one endures all that faithfully, then they'll be given life, that is eternal life, as their crown of victory, their victor's crown. So Christianity is teaching one thing, Christ teaches something else. We know that Christ is the truth. He's the way, the truth, and the life. And if Christianity is teaching something different, that makes Christianity a liar. I choose Christ over Christianity. How about you? This is R. Jerome Harris, the disciple. Thank you for listening.